After a recent wave of protests, China finally has accepted that they need to relax the COVID restrictions. CCP has now promised a more dynamic approach where the affected areas or localities will be locked down instead of entire cities. The policy shift has been accompanied by rapid changes in propaganda in both state media and official statements. Now the CCP has started to downplay the risks of COVID and has pushed its provincial-level government officials under the bus, saying they were responsible for the over-enthusiastic implementation of the lockdowns. Most people, as well as the mainstream media, have bought into the propaganda, saying China is finally listening to its citizens. But I have a hard time believing in what the Chinese officials or the state-run media have to say, because they have a history of lying to the masses. There are multiple reasons for speculating that the CCP is lying or is telling the half-truth apart from their prior history. First and foremost of which is that just COVID testing accounts for 1.5 to 1.9% of the Chinese economy. This is not an insignificant chunk, but even more astonishingly, the affected regions account for 15.7% of China's economy, according to a survey by Nomura, which includes the mass test centers, as well as the quarantine camps that China so enthusiastically builds. Now you might think, how can a government-funded test center and quarantine camp generate so much revenue? Well, the answer is simple. These COVID measures that the citizens are forced to take are not paid for or even subsidized by the government. Initially it was, but was changed very quickly when the CCP realized that COVID is here to stay, and the zero COVID measures will bleed them dry. So they very conveniently asked the citizens to bear the economic brunt of these measures, which, might I remind you, are mandatory for all its citizens to partake in. Coming back to the part where China so enthusiastically builds these COVID quarantine facilities, if the CCP was serious about reducing the stringent COVID measures, why are they building so many new facilities all over the country? And if you think these facilities are small, you are sorely mistaken, as the smallest ones can house around 20,000, and the larger ones could house around 100,000 people. Because building these huge quarantine facilities are expensive, and if they want to curb the restrictions, why would they still be actively building so many of them all over the country? Well, it is because China has now moved on to newer and more sinister methods to make money. As mentioned earlier, these COVID measures have resulted in a steady flow of income for the Chinese government. And now more than ever, they need this steady cash flow, as for the first time since 2008, the Chinese economy has seen its GDP figures fall. Why would they give the goose that laid the golden eggs up? Because, if you come to think of it, CCP is capable of changing anyone's health code, as witnessed in the protests a few days back. And anyone with a yellow or red health code is eligible to go to these camps, so it's the easiest way to make money. Send people to these camps, which are likely like prisons, and ask the prisoners to pay for their stay, which I'll remind you again that it is not optional. Buses and COVID workers will forcefully take you to these camps, ensuring a steady stream of revenue fills up the coffers of the CCP officials. And last but not least, the Chinese Grand Prix, which was supposed to happen in 2023, has been canceled due to concerns about the pandemic. As we have seen during the Winter Olympics, if China wanted to host a sporting event, they'll do it at all costs. So why stop with the Grand Prix? The only reason I could think of is that these stringent lockdowns will only get stricter. Although it's all speculation based on facts, only time and the Politburo can tell what the future holds for Chinese citizens. But if we were to go off of Chinese history, and how they managed crises in the past, things don't look too good for the common person of China, who is the real victim in all of this mismanagement and lunacy of the CCP. Chinese President/dictator Xi Jinping is set to arrive in Saudi Arabia on the 7th of December for a 3-day-long summit. Xi's trip begins on Wednesday and will include the China-Arab Summit alongside the China-GCC Summit. The prospects of economic development for both countries will be discussed. At least 14 Arab leaders of state are said to attend the China-Arab Summit, according to CNN's diplomatic sources, who also added that it was a milestone for Arab-Chinese relations, which is said to lead to a strategic agreement between the authoritarian powers. The trip is the culmination of decades of cooperation, once based on oil sales, which has grown into bilateral trade of close to $90 billion a year.
中国将继续从海合会国家持续大量进口原油，扩大进口液化天然气。
If you were to ask me if it is a slightly concerning turn of events, because not only do both countries have an atrocious record of human rights abuses, but Saudi Arabia is extremely efficient at squashing any form of dissidence. It was one of the very few Middle Eastern countries that escaped the Arab Spring relatively unscathed. And China might be interested in taking a page from their book on how to squash any future protests. The reception of Xi Jinping is on the scale of the one afforded to Donald Trump during the early months of his administration, which is in stark contrast to the one Joe Biden got, which was low-key and rather bland, when he visited Jeddah in August. Rumors of the Chinese presidential visit to the U.S.'s largest ally in the Middle East had been circulating for months, and were confirmed last week when Saudi Arabia sent out registration forms for media personnel without confirming the exact dates. Reports of the long-awaited visit come against the backdrop of several disagreements harbored by the U.S. toward both Beijing and Riyadh, which to Washington's dismay have only solidified ties in recent years. The United States and Saudi Arabia are already in a heated disagreement over oil production. This came to a head in October when the Saudi-led oil cartel OPEC reduced the output by 2 million barrels to stabilize oil prices. This decision was taken despite the U.S. campaigning against it. Saudi Arabia has been a strong ally of the U.S. for 8 long decades, who has now become bitter over the security presence in the region, especially amid the growing threats from Iran and its Yemeni proxies. Meanwhile, China has been at odds with the U.S. over the Taiwan issue, and Biden vowed to protect Taiwan in case China was ever to become aggressive, which puts the U.S.-China relationship in a precarious situation. Even more concerningly, Saudi Arabia and Gulf states have been deepening ties with Russia and China over recent years as they question the security partnership that had underpinned relationships over recent decades. The UAE has been particularly aggrieved by what it sees as Washington's lack of support for attacks on its capital earlier this year by Houthi forces in Yemen, and for the 2017 offensive it co-launched with Riyadh against Houthi groups. During all the kerfuffle caused by the protest, we all missed a very vital visit by British lawmakers to Taiwan. Members of the Foreign Affairs Committee met with high-level officials, including Taiwan's Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu. The committee is a parliamentary body that is separate from the government and made up of elected officials from a variety of different parties. It scrutinizes government policies but does not have any statutory powers. This all comes after declining relations between the UK and China for the past several years, embroiled in rows of human rights, economic policy, and China's approach to Hong Kong, a former British colony that was assured its freedom from China and its lawmakers for the 50 years since the day of its independence. The visit was part of a shift in the UK's policy to focus more on the Indo-Pacific region since it left the EU. Whilst the UK sticks to its statement that it's entirely right for democracies to engage in dialogue, the Chinese side calls it a flagrant violation of the One China principle. The Chinese spokesperson posted a statement on Twitter stating, "The Chinese side urges the UK side to abide by its commitment, stop any actions that violate the One China principle, and stop interfering in China's internal affairs. Moves of the UK side that undermine China's interests will be met with forceful responses from the Chinese side." The comments follow a speech by the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in which he said that the so-called golden era of relations with China is over.
We also need to evolve our approach to China. Now let's be clear, the so-called golden era is over.
He also added that the close economic ties with China in the previous decade were naive, but also said the global significance of China could not be ignored.
Along with the naive idea that trade would automatically lead to social and political reform. But nor should we rely on simplistic Cold War rhetoric.
Then he went on to say, "We recognize China poses a systematic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves toward even greater authoritarianism.
We recognize China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism."
So now finally countries are standing up and realizing that working with an authoritarian government with countless human rights abuses is not the brightest of ideas. Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs tweeted that Mr. Wu held a banquet for the UK delegation and spoke about increasing authoritarian threats as well as worrying issues at home and abroad. China was not too happy about the visit and decided to throw a temper tantrum. China's UK ambassador has urged British politicians not to dance to the tune of the United States and vowed severe consequences should MPs set foot in Taiwan. He also said, It is an interference in China's internal affairs that will inevitably lead to severe consequences in China-UK relations. We call on the UK side to abide by its commitment and not to underestimate the extreme sensitivity of the Taiwan issue, and not to follow the US's footsteps. But so far, none of the consequences have been seen, although it might be because of the protests that completely blindsided the government. If you like this video and want to stay updated with recent news from China, consider subscribing to the channel and ring the bell icon so you can know every time we upload a new video. And please like and comment on the video if you liked it. It helps us with the YouTube algorithm and allows us to reach more people and educate them about the tyrannical regime of China.